Hey everybody, Ragnarok here. Really excited because I did end up tying, as I mentioned in one of my other videos, for first place for the World Open, and I wanted to do the next 8 videos going over the games that I played. So it always seems like when I start off tournaments, at least the last 2 I've done, I start with a draw, and that's the case with this one. And I was starting as white, and I don't know, I guess it's kind of a drawish opening in some ways. I do play a lot of Italian games, and which is exactly what I played here with e4, e5, knight f3, knight f6, or knight c6, and then bishop c4. And you know, as you guys have seen in my other videos, in my articles on Rag Chess, I do talk about Evans Gambit a lot, which I would have played, even though, you know, maybe it's not the most sound. It does say inaccuracy as soon as you play b4 on move 4, sorry. But you know, this guy, he played knight to f6, which is, you know, kind of turns into a slow, boring Italian game. Giucco Pianissimo, in this case, with d6, or d3. And, you know, it just kind of like, I think I missed some opportunities here, and we ended up settling on a draw later on, even though there probably could have been some more play for both sides, but it was just kind of tougher because I did the 4-day tournament, so that means that I had less time on the first 2 matches. I only had an hour versus 2.5 hours on the other times. So let's continue with the game. He turns it into a Hungarian with knight to e7. Not the most aggressive. It's a pretty passive opening. Castling, and then this is just to create space so my bishop can come back. Because if I didn't do that, he could come over here and my bishop would have no squares to go, and he's getting a knight for a bishop pretty early, which is a pretty big concession for me. So I often like to go to a4 whenever I play the Giucco Pianissimo. So standard, but again, most times black will have their bishop on c5, and because he's playing with this pawn structure, this is now a very bad bishop because he has all of his pawns on dark squares, whereas all mine are on light squares. So this bishop is what's being known as outside of the pawn chain. So because it's here, it has a nice site on f7. But and then this bishop will be pretty good later on because it has a lot more places that it can travel to. Conversely, like his bishop can't really go, can't go anywhere at all. I mean, it's really just like a defensive piece. And then this bishop can't go too many squares. Often it'll come to g4. In this case, he comes to e6. So I just get on with the Giucco Pianissimo, which is c3, and then you're going to push d4 slowly. I do need to bring my rook over and maybe this knight to d2 first, however. And this is also a wasted move for him because this bishop, I talked with him after the game. I think he was eyeing up coming over here and taking this pawn eventually, maybe getting the queen here and taking this pawn at some point, but this is pretty well protected by these 2 pieces. My bishop could come back here at some point, but I think the best move here probably is to start pushing b4, b5, and just kind of get some more space on the queen side. But for some reason I decided to just develop my knight. It's an okay move, but the problem is it blocks in my bishop, so it really can't see any action, and a little bit of a inaccuracy, I guess you could say. So he corrected his mistake by moving to e6, and I didn't want to take because if I take, let's just go through, if I take, his pawn takes, he's got a nice pawn structure because this is an open or semi-open f-file for him, and that's why it's good. And then, yes, he has doubled up pawns, but his plan is to push d5 anyway and kind of disrupt my center. My knight's in a weird spot where it should be over here usually. So d5 would be coming if I did that. So I decided to go rook to e1 instead, because if he pushes and I take, now I've got an open file, or semi-open file at this point because there's a pawn here, but I could protect him pushing forward as well as maybe having sights on this knight, this bishop at some point. So that would be my plan if he pushed to d5 at that point. And I really just kind of decided to attack the center here, which is not a mistake. I mean, I am threatening to push my pawn here. If he does something like this, I've now got a fork on both these pieces here, which would be good. So he has to worry about that and pretty much has to take. And then I get the ideal center. Generally, you want to have these pawns here. Now, I wish my knight were here on c3. That would probably be a much better place for it, but often in this opening, you'll have your knight here. But the reason it would have been nicer earlier to have my pawn here is because I could start pushing it again, like I mentioned, but also this bishop could come over to b2 and have better sights on the black king instead of just kind of doing nothing back here. So there is a really good move here that's pretty standard in openings that you want to go after, and the move is d5. So anytime you have this nice pawn structure, it's always a nice idea as black to try to disrupt it with a pawn, especially this one, which now opens up his dark squared bishop. So this is a really good move by him, really awesome for him, not for me, unfortunately, because it breaks up my nice pawn center. So I take, and as you can see, I have an isolated queen pawn, and when you have that, it can be really good as long as you have a lot of pieces on the board, which I do right now. But as you can see, he's attacking 2 pieces right now. So if I start trading, this turns into a bad position for me because my isolated queen pawn will eventually become a liability. He'll bring his rook over here. He could stop it from moving forward with c6. He could potentially, well, actually the biggest problem here is I don't have my light squared bishop anymore. When you have an isolated queen pawn, you want to control the square in front of it because it's very hard for me to get rid of this knight that he has right now. Knight's in the perfect spot. You want to get a piece in front of it. So this would be really good for him if that happened. So I decide as quick as possible, I got to get rid of this isolated queen pawn. So I try to force him to trade. Now he doesn't have to trade. I think something like this would be a good move. And again, if I start trading, like it's not going to be good for me. In this scenario, I keep the light squared bishop, but he's probably, if I do something, just going to come here again anyway. So he does end up taking, which is a bit of a mistake because now when I take his piece back, the knight has no good squares to go to. All of these squares are being occupied by me. My pieces are his pieces, so he's forced to go to the back rank. And I thought that maybe I was getting a little bit of an edge here. The engine does say I'm at plus 0.4, so not a huge advantage, but you know, it's still an advantage. So I decided to bring my knight over here. Now, if he does take, you know, there is the threat of me taking his queen, so he can't exactly do that. So he brings his rook over. Now that I have my isolated queen pawn gone, it's, as you can see, connected with these other pieces. I decided to start trading. So my biggest problem is gone, my weakness of the isolated queen pawn. I do have 2 very weird pawns, but at the same time they're advanced, and this one is blocking his knight from coming back into the game. The knight actually can't even move at all right now. So I would like to keep this here, but in the same way that he pushed d5 earlier, he's going to try to push f6 at some point to try to attack this not passed pawn, but it's a pretty far advanced pawn. So I just start to develop. The engine is pointing out that he could have come here. If I go back, I do kind of think like this move might have been a little bit better. Maybe my bishop should be over here instead. It also kind of blocks his rook from coming over here. But this is a mistake from him because he tries to put tempo on my rook. The problem is my rook was probably going to come here anyway to try to control the squares here and start pushing this pawn, which is what I do. So he kind of like helps me out. And then he comes over here trying to attack this pawn. And this is good because it limits this rook. This rook now can't move over here like I want to. Try to control both of these C and D files. And this wasn't, I don't think this is a mistake. I think this is a good move to come here. But the problem is if he does play f6 like he wants to, he can then bring his bishop and block in my rook. Then all he has to do is attack it, which he can do with knight f6. So that's what he tries to do. And then it almost forces me to take because, or push the pawn, sorry. Because if I take, I mean, I'm just helping him out. In this scenario, maybe I'd get the pawn. But, you know, he could take with something else. And then now he's free to develop his knight out once he protects this pawn. And I didn't really like that because the best thing I can think about is when your opponent is kind of like limited in his moves. It's better to keep that tension and keep the pieces from moving like the knight can't move right now. So when I move forward, I mean, yes, the knight can come up, but because I'm threatening this pawn, it's actually better for him to do the move that he did here, which is to bring his bishop back to d6. Despite it saying it's a mistake. Let's look at that for a second. It's saying to come here. What would be the reason for that? I guess to bring your knight out here, because I'm threatening to push this pawn and then bring my rook up, which would be on checking the king. That's pretty dangerous. Not sure if it's winning or not. I don't know what the engine scores. I've turned it off, except it seems to show those highlighted moves. But let's look at a couple variations. Just see what line it's talking about here. Yeah, I mean, this looks pretty good for white. I don't know why I would recommend that. Yeah, how does black combat this? I guess he comes here or something like that to defend that. Yeah, I don't know. It's still another line. So he goes to d6. I think that right now, I don't know, the engine set recommending this. I think coming here was okay. Although it does drop me about a point. Let's see. I think my goal really was to protect this pawn and maybe start pushing the f4, f5 pawn. And a good idea that I missed at this point would actually be to play, I think, g4. G4 is good because it controls this square, and if let's say he makes a move and I bring my knight in here, he can't really do anything like try to pressure my knight away because I always have this move. This essentially wins the game, I think. The rook can't go anywhere, and I mean the knight can't move at all, but I have some threats here if the knight ever moved of almost checkmate. But yeah, this will win a piece, so like he can't do that right now. He's very stuck in the corner. So that would have been a good idea. I actually found that after the game when we were analyzing it. Instead, I came back here and attacked the rook, which not the greatest move because it allows him to come away from here. Allows my rook to come into the game, but he has some threats now. So if I were to do something like this, actually no, so the idea is if I push this pawn, actually maybe it didn't work. The threat is like a check here, and then he wins the rook. But in this scenario, I would just win the rook right back, and I'd actually be up a piece there. But that idea is kind of in the back of his mind here. And I've allowed this rook to come back into the game too, where it was doing not that much. It was pretty passive over here. So that was a mistake for me. Just you kind of want to make sure your opponent is, if they're already passive, keep them that way. Don't try to give them any activity back into the game. That's the biggest takeaway I can think of for that. So at this point, this is a threat now because my rook is under attack, or can be under attack. So I decided to come back here. This is where he offered a draw, and again, I had about 8 minutes left in this shorter time game, so I actually took the draw. If you look at it though, I think I'm actually doing pretty good here. I think I thought this pawn was lost at this point. So this is the idea. If he comes here, I have to take. I mean, there's nowhere else for my rook to go. I don't think there's any counterplay here. Let's see. Yeah, I would just lose the pawn in that scenario. But if I take, and this is why I moved my knight out of the way, because if I take here, I've given up my bishop, which could be strong. He has these doubled pawns, but I don't know, maybe I come over to e1. I have to worry about back rag checkmates. Again, if I ever push this pawn, he has ideas of coming here. Maybe he does this first. This looks pretty good though. I don't know. I don't mind that I took the draw because the way the end result was, and I probably would have versed different people along the way. But you know, this doesn't look bad for me. But really is the trouble of time pressure that really catches up to you. So again, I ended up winning or tying for first with 3 other people in the World Open and under 1800 section. And this game was a draw. My very last game was a draw, and I had 1 bye, which is where you get you have to skip the round, but you get half a point. So it's the same as a draw. So hopefully you guys enjoyed this. Let me know what you think about this game. There were definitely some improvements I could have made. I just didn't find things quick enough because just the way the position was. So I do think that I played really well in this tournament, and hopefully you guys enjoy the next couple videos showing the games.